Tantor Audio, a division of Recorded Books, presents Why the 90s Matter by Terry H. Anderson. Narrated by David Marantz. Preface. What are some terms that Americans did not know at the beginning of the 1990s, but did at the end of the era in 2001? Velvet revolutions, Internet, Cleary Act, Golden Visa, NAFTA, Rodney King, Jennifer Flowers, Whitewater, Ruby Ridge, cyberspace, IMDb, Netscape, Timothy McVeigh, infotainment, Dolly the Sheep, laptop, Paula Jones, information superhighway, browsers, search engines, Fox News, Google, autocorrect, Hotmail, Yahoo, MSNBC, app, Secure Sockets Layer, SSL, Monster.com, eBay, Match.com, PayPal, E-Trade, Dayton Accords, HIPAA, Monica Lewinsky, smartphone, Kyoto Protocol, Osama bin Laden, digital divide, chip, selfie, InfoWars, BlackBerry, Bush v. Gore, 9/11. What are some terms and phrases that took on a new meaning or emphasis during that same era? Gulf War, PC, real-time, Cold War, global warming, Hubble Space Telescope, sexual harassment, surfing, HIV/AIDS, Amazon, geek, domestic violence, hacked, bipartisanship, OJ, reboot, hip-hop, terrorists, connected, social media, viral, website, device, wired. This book is about the American 90s, and others have expressed their views of the era. Veteran reporter Haynes Johnson wrote the first book on the epoch and gave away his interpretation with the title, The Best of Times. Johnson, of course, realized that his interpretation might be too positive, and that the era was both wonderful but woeful. Over the years, others joined in with their evaluations. Conservative commentator Charles Krauthammer wrote in 2004 that the 90s was our retreat from seriousness, our Seinfeld decade of obsessive ordinariness, a time of domesticity, triviality, and self-absorption. By 2008, Krauthammer was piling it on, calling it a holiday from history. After all, he wrote, what was Clinton's greatest crisis? A farcical sexual dalliance. Then Krauthammer got out his battering ram, bludgeoning the era as the most inconsequential decade of the 20th century. Some years later, while running for the Republican nomination for president in 2015, former Florida Governor Jeb Bush commented that, if someone wants to run a campaign about 90s nostalgia, it's not going to be very successful. That provoked cultural writer and baby boomer Kurt Anderson to blast back, the best decade ever? The 1990s, obviously. He reviewed the thriving economy, strong job creation, federal budget surpluses, and the stock market increasing by over 300%. He reviewed the Soviet collapse, the suppression of AIDS, and the emergence of powerful laptops, the digital age, and smartphones. Plus, if you were a man and worked in an office, starting in the 90s you could get away with never wearing a necktie. And then he smacked his readers. Wasn't the release of Nirvana's Nevermind in 1991 pretty much the last time a new rock and roll band truly, deeply mattered the way rock and roll did in the 60s and 70s? Wasn't hip-hop, which achieved its mass-market breakthrough and dominance in the 90s, the last genuinely new and consequential invention of American pop culture? Perhaps. Everyone who lived through the era would write a different volume, mostly based on what issues and events had impact on their own lives. This book is not a traditional history. It does not examine all major people, issues, and events of that era. In this book, the listener will not find an investigation of political initiatives that failed to become law, diplomatic proposals that did not change international relations, judicial cases with little consequences, natural disasters such as the Great Flood of '93, or sporting events such as who won the World Series or Super Bowls. Nor is much space spent on pop culture, Mariah Carey or Jennifer Aniston, grunge or hip-hop, primetime TV shows, Cheers or Seinfeld, late night with Leno v. Letterman, blockbuster films, Titanic or Jurassic Park, or bestsellers with Harry Potter. And with few significant exceptions, celebrities are not examined in this volume. Instead, this book simply asks a complex question. Why did the '90s matter? Chronologically, between the collapse of the Soviet Union and Desert Storm and the tragedy of September 11, 2001, who were the people, what were the issues and events, the technological innovations and new businesses that had a profound impact, that made us what we are today, that changed the course of America? This book begins with an introduction that examines two events that changed American and world history: the end of the Cold War and Desert Storm. Chapter 1 discusses the demise of the political center in the first few years of the '90s, and Chapter 2 is more thematic on the rise of angry white men. Chapter 3 returns to mid-decade, when many commentators labeled the era the nervous '90s. Chapter 4 returns to a significant theme of the era, technological advancements, especially one that changed human behavior, the cyberspace or dot-com revolution. Chapter 5 examines the last years of the period when a number of events occurred that demonstrated that social and cultural forces that had been developing for years merged into anything goes America. The epilogue recounts the tragedy of 9/11, and Conclusions connects the dots between the era and more recent times, answering why the '90s matter. Writing a recent history is fraught with peril, but after a generation has passed, it is time for this historian to ask and try to answer, how did we get here? Introduction. New World Order, Last Superpower Standing, and Desert Storm. Since the end of World War II, the Grand Alliance that crushed Hitler's Germany, the United States, Great Britain, and the Soviet Union, had dissolved into West versus East, democratic capitalism versus communism, or, as journalist Walter Lippmann termed the competition, a Cold War. The Soviets consolidated their hold on Eastern Europe, and the Americans formed alliances with nations in the West. Both sides competed for influence in the results of decolonization, the new nations of Africa and Asia. Then in 1949, the Russians exploded their first atomic device, meaning that the two superpowers soon had the A-bombs and missiles to destroy every living being on Earth. That same year, the United States and 11 other nations formed the North Atlantic Treaty Organization, NATO, to prevent Soviet expansion into Western Europe. Article 5 set the gold standard for alliances, stating that an attack on one member would be considered an attack on all. As the first Secretary-General of the organization said, the purpose of NATO in Europe was to keep the Russians out, the Americans in, and the Germans down. The tense Cold War continued for over 4 decades. To contain communist expansion, America fought wars in Korea and Vietnam, and then in December 1979, the Soviets stumbled into their own Vietnam, a fractured nation of tribal minorities and warlords, Afghanistan. Their aim was to stabilize a friendly leftist government in Kabul. "Do not worry," Soviet Premier Leonid Brezhnev said to a colleague. "We will end this war in 3 or 4 weeks." Soon the Red Army was bogged down in a long, bloody, and costly conflict, while Americans were aiding their Islamic enemy, the Mujahideen, or Holy Warriors. The United States supplied them with Stinger anti-aircraft missiles and rocket launchers, and eventually the Afghans shot down more than 270 Soviet helicopters and aircraft. Ronald Reagan became president talking tough about the Soviet Union, the evil empire, and pledging an American military buildup. The old hardline Soviet leadership changed in 1982 when Brezhnev died. He was replaced by Yuri Andropov, who lived only until early 1984 when Konstantin Chernenko took charge, but he lived only until early 1985. When reporters asked the president why he didn't reduce world tensions and meet with the Soviets, Reagan quipped, "They keep dying on me." But not the next leader, Mikhail Gorbachev, who accepted party control in March 1985 when he was young for Soviet leadership, only 54. 7 months later, Reagan met Gorbachev in Geneva. The next year they met again in Reykjavik, Iceland, and then again the next year in Washington. At these summits, the two leaders discussed arms control, missiles, human rights, and conflicts in the world, including Afghanistan, and eventually signed the Intermediate-Range Nuclear Forces Treaty. The two men also developed a genial friendship while the Soviet leader was trying to recast his nation. Gorbachev realized his nation was in trouble. He had inherited a stagnant economy that could not produce enough food to feed its people. In 1982, the grain harvest was a failure for the third year in a row, a disastrous 66 million tons short of target, meaning that the nation had to import the largest grain amounts ever at costly Western prices. Bread and meat were hard to find, butter scarce, and the government had to use food rationing to prevent massive starvation, reminding older citizens of the dark days of World War II. Many American analysts thought that the Soviet gross domestic product, GDP, was about 50% of the American GDP. But by the end of the decade, the CIA reported that it was only about 15%. After all, the USSR produced few items that the rest of the world wanted to buy. It was an economy based on forcing its Eastern European satellites to buy its substandard manufactured items, such as vehicles, and the rest of the world to purchase its vodka, military hardware, and its prized possessions, gas and oil. Then oil prices plunged. In 1980, a barrel of oil sold for about $32. But new exploration resulted in surging supplies, and then the oil bust of 1986. By the end of the decade, oil was $12, deflating the Soviet budget. All the while, the USSR subsidized its client states, Cuba, Vietnam, Nicaragua, Angola, and of course Afghanistan. By the mid-1980s, the ailing Soviet economy was spending about $20 billion a year to support those impoverished allies. Meanwhile, the war in Afghanistan became the Kremlin's Waterloo. Like the United States in Vietnam, after a few years, Soviet citizens turned against their conflict, grumbling about its toll. Mothers and wives bombarded Gorbachev with letters demanding to know when their soldiers would come home, when the war would end. The bloody conflict continued for a decade, leading to the deaths of almost 1 million Afghans. The USSR spent about $2 billion a year fighting for Kabul, and some 15,000 Red Army personnel perished, while about 35,000 were injured. Moreover, the rest of the Muslim world was unhappy that Russia was killing Islamic fighters, resulting in a Middle East aversion to purchasing one of the Kremlin's profit makers, military arms. The economic burden was unbearable, and then in 1986, the Chernobyl explosion in northern Ukraine, the worst nuclear disaster in history, released more radioactive gas than both atomic bombs dropped on Hiroshima and Nagasaki. The blast killed 30 people and caused the evacuation of more than 100,000. The toxic pollution quickly expanded into neighboring Soviet states, then into Eastern Europe. This eventually caused thousands of deaths, outraged those populations, cost billions to clean up, and dramatically increased anti-Soviet feelings. That certainly was true in Poland. In 1980, Lech Wałęsa and others founded the Solidarity Trade Union at the Lenin shipyard in Gdansk, Poland. Within a year it became incredibly popular, with some 10 million members, a third of the nation's working-age population, and Poland recognized it as the first independent union in the Soviet bloc. Solidarity was a non-violent movement, and it successfully agitated against the Polish Communist Party bosses, gaining support and inspiring other calls for social change throughout Eastern Europe. Gorbachev responded to these troubles by declaring his policies of perestroika and glasnost. The former began reforming the economic and political system, especially increasing efficiency, decreasing central planning, and slowly moving toward a market economy. "We are not giving up on socialism," he announced to his citizens in 1987. "We want to make it better." Glasnost was aimed at opening the Soviet state by disseminating more information and consulting with its people. Gorbachev was beginning to pry open the closed Soviet system. He never realized the potential consequences. Mikhail Gorbachev had 3 blind spots that assured his failure at home and accelerated the collapse of the Soviet Union, wrote CIA Director Robert Gates. He believed communist rule could be reformed and stay in power, that the Soviet economy could be revived, and that the people in the Soviet states and Eastern Europe would want to remain in a reformed USSR. Gorbachev was wrong on every count. As the Kremlin struggled, activists in the Eastern European satellites struck. They began to agitate for more freedoms. The Baltic states asserted their right to protect their environment, then began making claims for sovereignty and independence. Then Gorbachev shocked the world. He visited Paris in July 1987 and surprised listeners by declaring that interference in domestic affairs and any attempts to restrict the sovereignty of states, friends, allies, or any others, are inadmissible. He called for the reduction of tactical nuclear weapons in Europe, and then declared that social and political orders in countries have changed in the past and may change in the future, but this change is the exclusive affair of the people in that country and is their choice. In December 1988, the Soviet leader gave a speech to the United Nations and declared that his government would cut its armed forces, reduce conventional weapons, and pull more than 50,000 troops and 5,000 tanks out of East Germany, Hungary, and Czechoslovakia. Unlike all Soviet rulers after World War II, in spring 1989 he began to withdraw the Red Army from Eastern Europe. By April 1989, Poles were calling for reforms and freedom, and that encouraged activists to make similar calls in Hungary, East Germany, Bulgaria, Czechoslovakia, and Romania. Since Stalin, the Soviet Union had crushed popular uprisings in East Germany, Poland, Hungary, and Czechoslovakia. Gorbachev ended that repression. The Soviet leader became wildly popular in Europe, Gorbimania, and his visits attracted huge crowds. But his statements also opened the floodgates, and what rushed through were the non-violent Velvet Revolutions. In August, Poles held free elections, and they elected a non-communist government. The next month, Hungary opened its borders with Austria, allowing people to flee. In October, the Hungarian Communist Party became socialist. In November, Germans dismantled the Berlin Wall, and Bulgarians ousted their communist boss and began elections. In Prague, the protesters took to the streets, and by the next month the communist bosses left, and the playwright and political dissident Václav Havel became president. And in Romania, the hated communist boss Nicolae Ceausescu and his wife fled the capital and were captured by soldiers, who quickly became a firing squad and executed them. Meanwhile, President George H.W. Bush watched from the White House. He had inherited and wanted to continue Reagan's policy of befriending and building trust with Gorbachev. To win the 1988 presidential election, however, he had to appease the hardliners in his party, and so when he held a private meeting with the Soviet leader, he told him not to pay any attention to his tough stance on the USSR, that he fully intended to work together after the election. Gorbachev later called it the most important talk Bush and I ever had. After the election, and while the Soviets were moving away from communism and Eastern Europeans were enacting their velvet revolutions, Bush adopted a policy of pauza, a pause in foreign policies, while Gorbachev pursued perestroika and glasnost. Bush told reporters that he did not want to poke a stick in the eye of Mr. Gorbachev, nor did he want to drive wedges between the Soviet Union and Eastern Europe. The United States would stay out of the way and watch the Eastern Bloc break away from Soviet control. Simultaneously, the Soviet Union began falling apart. Gorbachev's attempts to reform the USSR led him to allow elections in March 1989 for a new Congress of People's Deputies. The results were shocking. Communist Party members lost in droves, and when the Congress convened, they did not thank Gorbachev for opening the closed system. They criticized his Soviet government. Russians held their own elections in spring 1990, and they elected Boris Yeltsin as president, a man who shortly thereafter condemned communism. Elected democratically in the largest Soviet republic, Yeltsin's ideas seemed more legitimate than those of anyone in memory. He proposed that Russia be granted the freedom to make its own economic and political decisions apart from the Soviet system, which appealed to the other 14 republics in the USSR. Over the summer, all the republics followed Yeltsin's example, declaring their independence from the USSR. Gorbachev attempted to hold his country together for the next year, proclaiming numerous proposals, but none worked. The only way previous communist bosses had kept the nation together was by the use of force, ordering the military to crush dissent. Gorbachev didn't have the stomach for bloodshed. He watched the republics leave, take over the police and local militia, elect leaders, and become independent. And he watched the Soviet Union dissolve. It was unbelievable that the Soviet Empire, born in the Revolution of 1917, could resign from history with almost no bloodshed by the end of 1991. It was a rare and great moment in history, reflected National Security Advisor Brent Scowcroft. The end of an era of enormous and unrelenting hostility had come in an instant, and most incredible of all, without a single shot being fired. It was also incredible that the Soviet Union, which lost about 25 million people in World War II, more than any other nation because of Hitler's Third Reich, would allow the reunification of East and West Germany. It was, as experts noted, the single most troublesome and dangerous issue of the Cold War. And for West Germany, also the most expensive, for to get Gorbachev to go along with reunification, Bonn pledged $750 million to pay for removing the Red Army, and eventually some $33 billion in financial aid to the USSR. Events transpired quickly in summer and autumn 1990. East Germany's economy collapsed, and leaders from both sections began talks. They signed their reunification treaty, and by October, that resulted in one Germany. The new Federal Republic of Germany then joined NATO. 3 years earlier, in 1987, President Reagan had gone to Berlin, looked into the eastern section behind the Brandenburg Gate, and declared, "Mr. Gorbachev, tear down this wall." Reagan's supporters claimed that the speech was part of the process that reunited Germany, freed Eastern Europe, and won the Cold War. A more accurate interpretation is that on the evening of November 9th to 10th, 1990, the German people literally tore down the Berlin Wall. Reagan was important because he befriended Gorbachev and increased trust and decreased tensions between the superpowers. But the USSR's demise was a result of its leaders making horrible decisions: a war of choice in Afghanistan, a centralized economy that could not feed its people, manufactured goods that could not compete on the world market, and falling oil prices, and Gorbachev. Changes in Eastern Europe, wrote Robert Gates, were due to the leader of the Soviet Union. It was, at the end of the day, a Soviet leader who let an empire slide away peacefully. Time magazine put Gorbachev on their January 1, 1990 cover and named him Man of the Decade. Americans and Westerners thought so, but in his own country he became persona non grata, the leader who allowed the painful collapse of a superpower, who lost the Cold War. 25 years later, some Russians still resented that loss and Gorbachev. "You Americans think you won the Cold War," President Vladimir Putin said to ExxonMobil CEO Rex Tillerson. "You did not win the Cold War. We never fought that war. We could have, but we didn't." As for President Reagan, he wasn't even in office when these monumental events unfolded. Referring to his Berlin speech, he wrote in his memoirs, "I never dreamed that in less than 3 years the wall would come down, and a 6,000-pound section would be sent to my presidential library." As the Soviet Empire was imploding during summer 1990, 2 world events were on the horizon, one in Africa and the other in the Middle East. After years of American business and government sanctions, along with a massive internal struggle, the apartheid government in South Africa finally was collapsing. The white minority of mostly Dutch Afrikaners had settled South Africa in the 17th century and formally established apartheid in 1948, subjugating the black majority to strict segregation. A few years later, in the 1950s, the African National Congress launched a defiance campaign disrupting the society and government. In response, the white government banned the ANC in 1960, and 2 years later arrested and imprisoned the prominent ANC activist Nelson Mandela. As he sat in prison during the 1980s, Archbishop Desmond Tutu and Reverend Alan Boesak organized huge marches in Cape Town, Pretoria, and Johannesburg, and that provoked the international community. Many Western nations imposed sanctions supported by the United Nations, but 2 world leaders resisted, President Ronald Reagan and Prime Minister Margaret Thatcher. They considered Mandela and the ANC as communists, a thought enthusiastically boosted by the apartheid regime. Nevertheless, the U.S. Congress and the British Parliament passed sanctions against the apartheid regime, and that put significant economic pressure on South Africa by the first year of the Bush administration. At the same time in Eastern Europe, the Velvet Revolutions were ending Soviet domination, which de-emphasized communism and energized democratic forces throughout the world, including South Africa. Mandela was released from prison in February 1990. Negotiations to end apartheid began, and 4 months later, President Bush hosted the ANC leader at the White House. Bush declared Mandela was a man who...
Sample complete. Ready to continue?